We all want to be amazing teachers with amazing students. But even with the most amazing ideas and resources and education, we often still scratch our heads and wonder things like, why didn't my student practice this week? Or why did Anna wait to the last minute to memorize her recital piece? Or even, why can't my students learn the notes I've been teaching them week after week after week? One of the biggest reasons we struggle with, though, is because we've just forgotten what it's like to be a child. And it doesn't matter if you're 79 or 49 or even 19. The fact is, we have still forgotten. And because we've forgotten, we become frustrated with children and with our students. We become frustrated and sometimes even angry. And then we search high and low for just the right solution to the problems that we don't even know exist. And so we find solutions to things that are not the real problem. But I've seen amazing things happen when we learn to tap into the power of understanding what it's like to be a child. When we truly understand what it's like to be a child and how they process things, our students will learn faster and more efficiently. They memorize things better, and they're so much more excited about lessons. But children are not nearly as mysterious as we think they are. There is so much research out there about how children process things and how children learn. And in addition to this research that I am going to be presenting to you in a workshop I'm going to tell you about in just a minute, I've also been blessed with 3 very unique case studies that just so happen to be living in my house and have been living here for a number of years. And I've become passionate about understanding how they learn and how they process things, and especially what their world is like. And in addition to that passion, I've become passionate about teaching teachers about these kinds of characteristics and how to apply them in your teaching of piano lessons. I think that understanding what it's like to be a child will help you to be a better teacher, even a better parent, even a better neighbor, and even a better grandparent. So I'm super excited because we're going to be releasing and launching the very popular workshop, Have You Forgotten What It's Like to Be a Child? 5 characteristics that we've forgotten and how to apply them. We're going to be releasing this on August the 30th as an online workshop. And if you purchase this workshop and you watch it individually, you are going to leave feeling like you understand children at a much deeper level. You're going to feel excited because you'll have tons of immediately useful tips that you know will be effective, and you'll also be super pumped about teaching. So mark your calendars for August the 30th because that's when we're going to release it. There's going to be a 4-day sale, super affordable, I promise. The great thing about this online workshop is that it's not a webinar. So you don't have to arrive on a certain date at a certain time and have the right speakers or the right device in front of you. You can watch it within a few hours of purchasing it, or you can wait several days or even weeks to watch it. So it's very, very flexible, and I feel like it will help you so much to be a more effective teacher as well as an effective parent and just an effective person who loves and reaches out and meets the needs of children. While you're waiting for the launch of Have You Forgotten What It's Like to Be a Child, I want to give you a tip that's similar to the kinds of tips I'm going to give you on the workshop. But this is completely different. It's not included, so this is an extra freebie that I want to just give you so that it will whet your appetite for what's coming. So here's one of those things that we've forgotten about being a child. Maybe we didn't even know it to begin with, but it's very helpful to know. New information must be related to something familiar in order for it to be stored in long-term memory. Now, Marie Ripple, who's an author and an educator, she's most notably known for writing a spelling curriculum. She explains it in a way I think that really brings it home to adults. She says, if there's nothing to relate the information to, there is no way for it to be stored in long-term memory. Instead, it is dropped from short-term memory and completely forgotten. If someone talks to you in Russian and you don't speak Russian, there is nothing for that information to connect to, and that information is dropped. Now, this is especially true when we're talking to our elementary students about abstract concepts. And we're going to talk more about the difference between abstract and concrete and how children relate to those things at younger ages in the workshop. But let's talk for a minute, for example, about explaining the 1 and the 5/7 chord, because that's pretty abstract. So you might say to a student, well, the 1 chord, this is called the 1 chord, and the 1 chord is like home base, and it's like the stable chord that really feels solid, and the 5/7 chord just feels like it's moving towards something. You can't really end on it, and it's moving towards the 1 chord. I mean, that's an okay explanation of the 1 and the 5/7 chord, but it doesn't really connect to a child. And so a lot of times it just goes over their head. But listen to the difference in what happens when you connect to something that a student is familiar with. And I'm going to use an example of a teaching friend. Her name is Melissa Willis. She graciously gave me the permission to share this story with you. She was telling me, or she was telling some people on a Facebook group that she was explaining this concept of 1 and 5/7 to a student, and the student incorrectly referred to the 5/7 as the V7. And then he said, wait, that kind of sounds like an engine or something. And she said, oh, you mean like a V6? And he said, yeah, but the V7 with 7 cylinders instead. And so she said, oh, wow, well, the V7 then must have lots of horsepower. Now, can you imagine her playing those 5/7 chords for him with lots of horsepower and pulling it to the 1 chord? Do you think that that student is going to remember the function and the sound of a 5/7 and a 1 chord much better than the student who listened to me just a minute ago explain it? Of course they are, because we relate it to something that they're familiar with. Now, granted, that student actually helped Melissa in telling her what he was familiar with, but it certainly is a good example of how this works. So knowing that new information must be connected to something familiar in order for it to be stored into long-term memory is only part of the solution. We have to know what to do with this information, and some of the things that we do in the workshop are talk about how knowing this information affects how a kid sees piano lessons and also how we teach. So first of all, let's look at how this impacts the way children see piano lessons. Number 1, children are bored with lessons if the information and activities presented are not related to something that they know. So if you wonder why your child or why your student is bored, that could be the reason. This is especially true of abstract concepts like we've talked about, like pretty much a lot of stuff in music, learning note names, learning key signatures, learning any number of things. All of those things are very abstract to children. Number 2, the familiar to which we relate something can be something that's related to music. So you certainly can say, well, forte is louder than piano if they already know what piano means. That's somewhat familiar, but it's so much more effective if you can relate it to something in their world that's been in their world for a while, like, for instance, animals, relating forte to a bear sound or relating piano to the sound of a mouse or something like that. It's much more effective to relate it to something with which they are particularly familiar and have been familiar with for years. And number 3, when you relate information to things that kids know and love, kids think piano is fun. They'll think that they had a wonderful time at piano because you brought out a bear or something like that. It reminds me a little bit of what somebody's told me about being in a social setting as an adult. Sometimes you come away from a social setting and you wonder, oh, did they like me? I mean, did I make a good impression? And I've been told often that you can figure out whether you made a good impression or not by asking, did the person that was talking to you talk about themselves and talk about their family or talk about their work? Did they talk about that with lots of energy? If they did, even though you didn't say hardly anything about yourself, they'll feel like you're a pretty awesome person. And I feel like it's the same way with kids in piano. If we use things that they are familiar with and that they think are awesome, then they think piano's pretty awesome. Another thing that I do in the workshop for every one of the 5 characteristics that we discuss is to ask how this concept impacts the way that we teach. So how does knowing that new information must be related to something that's familiar, how does that impact the way that we teach piano lessons? Well, obviously, we have to try to relate concepts to things that are familiar with children. And I love this example. The Fabers do a wonderful job of introducing middle C in My First Piano Adventures as a cat. And I don't remember exactly how they do it, except what I do remember is that the whiskers come out of the note in such a way that that middle whisker looks like the line that goes through middle C. It's brilliant because it's bringing in what they know that children are familiar with, and then the child never forgets what middle C is. Leela Viss does this in a book that she has, an ebook that she has that relates intervals to shoes. Now, not every student is going to be interested in shoes, so it won't work for everyone, but it's a great example of how to really bring in something that a student might be interested in to teach something. Now, let me give you an example of something that didn't work. In my teaching for years, for whatever reason, I've insisted that my students learn a major sixth by knowing that it's the first interval in My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. Now, you're probably thinking, kids don't know that song. Well, this is true, but I insisted that they learn it, and I was so stubborn about this for a long time until I realized, you know what, I need to bring them into this. And so I started asking them, let's see if we can figure out a song that you know that has a major sixth in it. And it's really interesting what you find out when students suddenly have to be responsible for helping you figure out the answer. So that's a way not to do it, but we have to relate it to things they're familiar with, not the folk song that I learned however many years ago. Also, relating abstract concepts like technique to things kids are familiar with is also very important. I love how Piano Safari does this when it talks about the lion paw technique. You can tell your student, to play heavy on the keys, but that's so much different than telling them to play like they have a lion paw. Very, very effective. Diane Heidi does a wonderful job of this by talking about the ladybug hand position. And of course, she has a wonderful ladybug. You should definitely go check it out on dianeheidi.com. But she talks about how your hand basically needs to look like a ladybug. And so children just relate to that so much easier. The last concept, or the last example that I think of, is the doghouse concept. And they talk about the D being in the middle of the two black keys, and so the two black keys are your doghouse, and people have adorable illustrations for this. I want to say that's different than relating to notes to mnemonics. So, for example, FACE, every good boy does fine, or fat cats go down alleys eating bread. That kind of thing is not really relating the information to something they're familiar with. It's relating it to words. And relating these things to linguistics is much different than relating them to physical objects and experiences. So I want to make that distinction right there. The last thing I want to give you, though, and I want to do this in both of the videos that are going to come out before the launch, is to give you a free resource. Because in order to understand what it's like to be a child, you have to understand children and what they like. In order to relate something to what they are familiar with, you have to know what they're familiar with. So that's why I created a resource called Get to Know Me Teacher. If you've already downloaded this resource, you'll want to do it again for a couple of reasons. The first thing it does is it helps you get to know your individual students in an organized way, and you'll see how to do that when you open the document. But in addition to these worksheets, there is a list of, I believe it's 3 or 4 pages of ideas that teachers have shared freely about how to relate a music concept to things kids are familiar with. And so if you feel like, I don't know how to apply what she just talked about, go to that page and read those great ideas. They are phenomenal. So if you are on the blog post, please scroll down. You can see the download button now, or download now button. Please download it today. And then if you're not on the blog post, please go to composecreate.com and get on the blog post. Download that today. Stay tuned for August the 30th when we'll be releasing this special training, those 5 characteristics that we've forgotten about what it's like to be a child.